Welcome to Breaking Bias on Broadway and Beyond with Colette Luckie and Dr. Heather Sanders, where they answer the elusive question, why is cultural competence critical in today's multicultural environment, and what are the measurable outcomes and benefits of sustainable allyship? Ready to become aware of, address, and eventually break our cultural biases? Well, let's get into the show.
Hello, everyone. This is Colette Luckie of Breaking Bias on Broadway and Beyond. I am also joined by my co-host.
Hello, Dr. Heather.
As well as our two illustrious guests for today. The topic that we are discussing was actually born out of some of the reaction from the results of the election. I know probably out of 10 calls that I received the day after, at least 6 of them led in with DEI is dead. So I know we are living in somewhat of a kind of fatalist, culture. And that really spawned some thinking around, is DEI canceled, or are we just following sort of the terrorist rhetoric of the incoming administration? And so I invited Jay Hewlin and Karen Fleshman, both attorneys barred in the state of New York, to discuss some of the legal implications as well as the social ones related to the current state that we're in. And before we begin, I'd love to give both of them an opportunity to tell this audience about their business practices. Each of them have their own consulting practices. And yeah, we'd like to hear a little bit about that before we jump into the segment.
Yes.
Karen?
Oh, hello, everyone. My name is Karen Fleshman, she, her pronouns. And thank you so much, Colette and Dr. Heather, for inviting me. And I'm so delighted to finally meet you, Jay. I've heard so many wonderful things about you.
Thank you.
I founded my company, Racy Conversations, 10 years ago, right around this time. I have begun my career helping people fleeing violence in their countries to apply for asylum in the United States and helping permanent residents of the United States become US citizens. And then in the early 2000s, I shifted focus to workforce development, largely in response to learning the city of New York, where I lived at the time, 50% of Black men did not have a job, and there were almost 200,000 young adult New Yorkers, almost entirely Black and Latino, who were not in school, not working. So I shifted focus to preparing young adults of color for the workplace. And 10 years ago, right around this time, largely driven by protests in Ferguson, the non-indictment of Darren Wilson, and hearing from the young adults who I had helped get into corporate America about what it was like for them there, how much they enjoyed their incomes and their lifestyles and the work that they did, but how much they were also targeted by toxicity, that I shifted focus to preparing the workplace for young adults of color. And so my company is called Racy Conversations. We are a workplace workshop facilitation company focusing on racial equity and sexual harassment in the workplace.
Okay, great. Thank you, Karen.
Amazing, amazing, very good, very interesting, actually. Nice to meet you as well, and love the journey that you took to get here. My journey is different. My journey is a combination of things. One was my lived experience as a Black man growing up in New York City and being in an educational system that was inferior and objectively inferior, and coming through and having to work through that process. And I have an interesting social dynamic because I have people that I grew up with that went one direction and I went another direction. And what I mean by that specifically is that I came from a fairly good home, and because of that, and because of my affiliation with the church, I kind of got through and got my education and went the educational route, and was the recipient of the benefits of, you know, getting a job as a result of that. But I have other people in my life that I know that didn't have as much support and ended up going into other institutions that were not as favorable. Let's put it that way, prison and other things that were not as good. So there was a personal aspect to my story that kind of led me to where I am today. But on the professional level, I started off as a professional musician. I spent several years doing that, and I got interested in employment law while I was in law school. And when I came out of law school, I began working for a corporation, a law firm that did a lot of labor and employment law. And my experience as a individual, as a Black individual, as a Black male, as a manager in my previous work, kind of led me to a place while I was doing employment law that I realized that so much of the problems around discrimination were people not knowing how to deal with people. Some of it was real discrimination, very clearly discrimination and discriminatory. But then there was an aspect of it that was just like, you just don't know how to deal with people. You don't know how to deal with anybody. But it doesn't matter if you're a woman, Black, gay, straight, you're just bad at it. And I had a passion for helping leaders become better leaders and helping organizations become better organizations through different policies, and more importantly, through training and better implementation of those policies. So the Hewlin Group, which is my company, works toward improving workplace culture by working on all levels, macro, micro, meso, and individual and corporate.
Right. Excellent, excellent. And I will say, and I think this is important to contribute, is that Jay is the sole reason, him and his wife, Professor Hewlin, who's also a professor at Columbia, and I know, Jay, you are at Columbia and NYU, if I'm tracking correctly.
Correct.
Was the sole reason why my company ended up on Broadway. It was Jay's connections through some of his work that he had done in the entertainment industry that introduced me and my practice into the Broadway arena. So I am eternally grateful and certainly appreciative. I've known Jay a very long time, and Karen less time, but certainly Karen and I have been connected also over the last 4 or 5 years. And I'll tell that little story of how I met Karen at the end. Because it certainly is a breaking bias story, my own bias. Okay. So yeah, so why don't we go ahead and jump in? I mean, obviously you both have reactions to the results of the election and how this may affect your practice, your life, your heart, your soul, your mind. So yeah, why don't we start there, and then we can certainly segue into some of the legal implications as well.
Who do you want to start? Yeah, Karen. That's been our cadence. That's been our cadence. So we'll stick with that. Go ahead, Karen.
Okay.
I am very, I don't even know. I've been on such an emotional roller coaster with this topic. The fundamental, undeniable truth is that we are becoming an increasingly diverse society, and that is not going to change anytime soon. I mean, that we're going to become majority people of color by 2045. Increasing numbers of people feel comfortable asserting their LGBTQ identity. Women are demanding greater safety, freedom, and justice in the workplace. Increasing numbers of people are disabled, and they're demanding accessibility. So all of these changes are happening in our society, and we're not going away. And at the same time, the overall direction of the federal government, and through it, all of our society is trying to preserve the the hierarchy, the racial hierarchy, the patriarchy, the dominant group. And I'm really reminded of what Derek Bell taught us. And I remember learning this, when I was very early in my anti-racism journey, that he said that racism is a permanent aspect of our society. And it's because elite whites must have the allegiance of the poor whites in order to maintain their power and privilege. And I just thought, oh no, I mean, clearly we're going to be able to show people that racism harms everybody, poor white people perhaps the most, because it prevents them from having access to things that everybody wants. And, surely Derek Bell, he's just like an extremely pessimistic person. Now I'm like, oh my God, how could I have been so naive and so, it's just, yeah, it's a lot to absorb.
Yeah, I just
Sure.
wanted to ask you really quickly, Karen, if you don't mind taking us through the election, the campaign journey.
Mhm.
Colette shared with me, I think right after the results were um, announced officially, and her and I were sort of commiserating about it, and she mentioned you and all of the thousands and thousands and thousands of doors that you knocked on. So I'm just wondering if you can walk us through that and talk to us about, the internal thought processes around it. Was your labor in vain?
No, I do not think that labor was in vain. And I do also believe that in order to win back this country, we have to have organizations that are on the ground in all 3,000 counties of the United States 24/7, meeting people where they are, getting them together, really understanding what the needs of the people are. Because in retrospect, having knocked on many doors, I wouldn't say thousands and thousands, but perhaps 1,000 in both Nevada and
All right.
Arizona. What the trend that I did see is that the neighborhood that had the most visible and most solid support for Kamala Harris was that neighborhood where the homes were worth $2.5 million. When I was knocking doors in more working class neighborhoods, there was still support for Kamala, but there were also plenty of Trump voters in those neighborhoods. And it was really interesting when I knocked on the door of a 30-something who was living in her own house, which was largely women. They were supporting Kamala. When I was knocking on the door of a 30-year-old who was living at home with his parents, and they were largely men, they were supporting Trump. So what I felt I was seeing is that the folks for whom the way the system is currently structured, it's working, were supporting Kamala. But there were a lot of people who did not believe, because also I was talking to them, what is top of mind for you? And nearly everyone said, what is top of mind for me is jobs and cost of living, particularly in Arizona, where it's been over 100 degrees for 3 months straight. People's utilities have shot through the roof, and it's an increasingly unaffordable place for them to live. And so I do believe that there was a lot of uh, economic self-interest, and people, for whatever reason, I would be like, Kamala is the daughter of a single mom. Don't you think she would be making decisions that are more beneficial for your family than the billionaire son of a rich man? Like,
Right.
but they didn't, they listened to me, but I don't think they were persuaded by that. Somehow they saw promise in Trump would reduce the cost of living and increase their earnings. And yeah, they didn't see that from Trump, from Kamala.
Yeah.
Okay.
So my reaction was, to put my reaction in context, I think it's important to understand that my individual situation really informed a lot. The week before the election, I visited Spelman College with my daughter. And while I was there, I had never visited Spelman or Morehouse for that matter. And while I was there, I saw just a ton of dynamic Black women running the show, and of course I've been around dynamic Black women all my life. My mother was one, but it was just an interesting concentration of people that looked like me, who happened to be women, who were running this institution and had been running it for over 100 years. And then in the midst of that, I saw these pictures of women from 1895 and 1921, these Black and white pictures, and I saw the determination on their faces.
Mhm.
And I looked at those photos and I said, Jay, whatever happens next week, you're going to be okay. Everybody's going to be okay. Because if these people could survive what they had to survive in 1895 as a Black woman in the South, trying to get an education, you're going to be all right. We will be all right. So the whole idea that DEI would die or DEI is dead is just utterly ridiculous, because Karen, what you said is exactly right. We ain't going away. We're just going to continue to increase in numbers. So my reaction to the election was like, yeah, we saw that momentum happening. We knew it was going to be close. There was a lot of, I want to respectfully say to you, Karen, I don't think you were as naive as you were hopeful. And I think that's what happens is you get hopeful and then you realize the reality sets in. I'm talking about you. I'm referencing your comment about Dr. Bell. And I'm thinking, no, that was hope. And it was dashed throughout various parts of your life, as it has been in my own, by the way, if I may presume to say that. But at the end of the day, I'm still very hopeful. And I think in some ways it is easier to deal with the wolf that than to deal with some perception that things are better. We had a big perception when Obama went into office, and a lot of people were talking about a post-racial society. I never bought into that, but it was good. It was hopeful. I mean, there were a lot of positives that came from that. But at the end of the day, we are still who we are. And the fact that we had the election that we had 8 years ago, and then a few weeks ago, I think it's a sobering moment. And I think for us, it's an opportunity to regroup and say, okay, what's really happening? This is where we are. And how do we mobilize in a way that's going to be helpful and sustainable?
Absolutely. Thank you both for sharing those thoughts. I think we're all in that same sort of post-mourning kind of phase at this point, where it's okay, we've cried, we've writhed on the ground, screamed, done all of these things, and now we are mobilizing, right? And really figuring out strategically what we can do to prevent a dystopian society from becoming a reality. And so when you think about, the social impact, what do you think would be the next steps from each of your purviews in terms of your client systems, the work that you do? I know, Jay, you and your wife do a lot of organization development work as well. So I know there is obviously change management and really getting into the structural kind of whole systems approach for clients is very important. And I know, Karen, you have, you've recently launched the Sisterhood Coalition. So I'd like you both to kind of just think about, those two business propositions and how you believe they will go forward in this particular era that we're in.
Yeah. Should we break it up a little bit, Karen? You think you want me to go first this
Yeah,
time?
you go first.
We're waiting for our host to tell us, but I guess we'll just take the lead.
Oh, yeah.
So, no, I think that, to the point that you made about the business that we're in, about organizational development, organizations still need to be developed. Workplaces are still going to be dysfunctional because we're full of dysfunctional people. And I'm talking about everybody. I'm talking about me included. Like, we all have our issues that we bring into the space.
Sure.
So that's not going to change. Conflict is going to continue to be there. And in fact, what we're dealing with is a clapback, right? So Obama became president, and then we got the clapback in Trump, and then there was another clapback, and now we have another clapback. So that's tension, and that tension is happening on a very visual scale, but it's happening on a very micro scale as well. So I see the need for us moving away from polarization to these places that we have in common. You know, and when you think about the weaponization of the term DEI, if you pull back from the weaponization of it and you think about what does it actually mean, let's take diversity out just for a moment, because diversity is probably the most explosive of those words in my experience. That may not be objectively true, but
Interesting.
But I'm sorry.
Oh, I just said interesting. Sorry.
Yeah. But if you talk to the average person about equity, they will agree in principle that things should be equitable. If you talk to the average person about what inclusion could mean, then that's probably equity is the easiest one. Inclusion to me is like second, and then diversity is the hardest in one way of looking at it. But if you think about inclusion, I've had companies that want people to be included as long as they're saying what we want them to say, and that's been on the left and the right. Right? If I may use those terms for the sake of this conversation. And I always have to say, no. If you're going to be inclusive, we've got to be inclusive, and we've got to include everybody, right? And so in principle, people get that. So I guess all of that to say that what we want to do is move away from how the press and how the media and how social media has used these terms and get back to the basics. You know, back in the 60s, they were talking about something called integration.
Right.
That word kind of left, you know, we don't use that anymore. But like DEI is just 3 words that are saying the same thing. You know, we want people to integrate into a common, for the common good of the organization, of the planet, of the world, of the country, whatever it is. But it's how do we define common good? That's where the challenge is. Because what I think is the common good, you may not think is a common good, because actually what you want is something that's good for you, and you couldn't care less about me. Right. But lastly, thinking of how, and I teach this in my negotiations class, how when you have a zero-sum mentality, you end up not maximizing the relationship or the deal. And I always talk about how do you, if you don't have a zero-sum mentality, if you have a we can all win, and by win-win, I don't mean 50-50, but we can all win, and you show people how they can win by cooperating and collaborating with you, then then you can move closer to the common good.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I really like the way you broke down DEI in terms of what is probably a turnoff or more threatening. And I think one of the reasons why the word diversity is because oftentimes the power structure, they don't consider themselves diverse, right? It is representative of everyone else that isn't white, right? And so that word, I think, is, knocks knees. I mean, people's, they get nervous about that. And I think what we're seeing right now is the pinnacle of that nervousness is, let's try to just crush it, denigrate it as much as possible, make it a 4-letter word, even though it's only 3 letters. But let's just try to erase it. But I also believe it can't be erased. As long as you have people here on this planet, you're not going to be able to just extricate it. So yeah, Karen.
Yes.
If I can add one thing before you go, Karen, I just wanted to comment on what Jay was saying. I do apologize. One of the things that I like that you mentioned, and we kind of talked about this in one of our last conversations, is that people will people, right? And you said that as long as we are working together, I mean, a part of the human condition is conflict, is all of the things. And so what I'm really excited about it, a part of a re-strategization sort of, process is that we get to look at some of the more basic concepts like collaboration is what you mentioned, conflict management, resolution, conflict navigation, how to coach, right? All of those things, addressing poor performance, but really include and embed how identity plays a role in how we do all of those things,
Right.
right? And so I think that you're absolutely onto something. I totally agree when you say that as long as we have people working together who are expected to collaborate, communicate, and create together, we'll always have a need to teach people how to be their best selves with one another, for one another, and for themselves as well. So I just wanted to add that and just
Yeah.
echo and affirm that. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Karen, I'm sorry.
Oh no, not at all. I'm glad you lifted that, Dr. Heather. I would like to read a quote from Paul Latipo, who I recommend everybody follow. He is a wonderful DEI educator on LinkedIn, and he posts almost every day with really insightful content. But he posted yesterday, he said, DEI won't be erased because it lives inside of everyone who wishes to make the world a more inclusive and equitable place. And I think that is why I'm definitely going to continue building the interracial sisterhood as an online community where we will also get together in person for real life events. But I think we need a space that is not on social media, that's its own contained private network where we're very intentional about who we let in. But it is a space for people who want to make the world a better place to be connected with each other and to use our people power as the lever of accountability. And I've talked about this for a long time, that when you think about it, DEI has not had a lever of accountability other than the workers for a very long time, right? You do not see corporate boards pressuring companies to become more diverse.
Right.
You do not see shareholders saying, we want you to become more diverse. You do not even see the EEOC coming after companies, right? I'm talking here largely about Silicon Valley. Even you see, like in Tesla, there are class action lawsuits of Black employees against Tesla, and yet Elon Musk was able to acquire these enormous other government contracts. That's how he became the wealthiest man in the world for his other companies. So the only lever for a long time has been the workers. And I am drawing a lot of hope right now. For the past year, I've been involved in training bus drivers in how to recognize and address racism in the workplace. And this has been by far the most fulfilling work I have done. They are diverse, they really care, they're open to learning. And I do believe that going forward, unions are going to play a hugely important role in preventing dystopia from setting in. And I think we need to think about, as DEI educators, to get out of the white collar, or, out of
Right.
corporate
Yes.
America and more to the working class Americans. And I think that that is how we can make a huge impact and shift in our society.
That's a good point.
Good. Excellent, excellent. And so one other curiosity that's out there, I know Heather and I have talked about this as well, is how Title VII and Title IX, how those things could possibly be affected, via some of these executive orders and some of this legislation. What do you perceive kind of maybe what we're going to be challenged with, and maybe perhaps some brainstorming around how we can combat that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think, the first Trump administration did demonstrate a pullback of a lot of enforcement mechanisms, or an attempt to pull back a lot of the enforcement mechanisms on civil rights. The whole effort in certain states, many states, unfortunately, to get rid of books and to get rid of the history is all an effort to kind of say none of this really matters. And I think that's where the mobilization and that's where the organization and the agreement has to come to say, yes, it does matter. We're not going to let you get rid of the history, the books. We're not going to let you get rid of the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. I mean, just kind of ridiculous things that people are trying to do. And I think that mobilization is not just necessary to force the issue, but I think it's also necessary to mitigate the fear. A lot of people, the EEOC stats and the stats that we have on cases that come about are really low. They don't represent what's actually happening in the workplace or the world, because most people don't file. Most people just get another job, but they suck it up, even worse, right? And so what we really have to work on is getting people not to be afraid. And you can only do that when they have the kind of support that they need. It may mean families coming together and saying, hey, Karen, quit that job or file that lawsuit. We will support you until you find another job. We're not thinking along those lines. When my mom and dad came, my mother and father were part of the Great Migration, right? So my mother was born in 1928. My father was born in 1922. They moved into New York in the late 40s, 50s. And so, but when they did that, my mother came up a couple of summers to work and lived with her sister. And that's not uncommon. That was very common. And so what I'm saying is we've embraced as people, I'm not talking about African Americans in particular. We seem to have embraced this notion of individualism at our own expense and not working together. And not only do I see it in the way that I just described, but I even see it in universities where people are like studying on their own when other cultures are doing group studying and moving themselves forward. Now, I'm generalizing a bit here because I'm not saying that's true of everybody, but it's true enough that we need to kind of, I'm saying a few things. Move us past the fear of making these challenges and having the kind of support that will allow us not to be so afraid and push these cases forward. Because under the last administration, a lot of more of those cases were pushed forward because there was a feeling of more support. Right. And the people that push these cases out throughout the decades, throughout the century, they had to overcome that fear, and they had to say, I'm going to sit on a bus, or I'm going to walk over this bridge, and I know that I may not come over on the other side of this bridge alive, right? There was fear involved, but courage only exists when fear exists, right? And so the courage overrode that, and that's kind of what we're going to need to do. And people like you, Karen, who are out on the forefront, there need to be more people that are out there, not just knocking on doors, but knocking on the judge's doors, so to speak, metaphorically. I'll stop there. Sorry.
No, good. Excellent. Karen,
I do worry about a couple of things. Number one, the Trump cabinet picks, who's appear like their sole intention is to destroy the department that they are going to head.
Yes.
This whatever the Doge Department of Government.
Yeah.
That Elon Musk is going to decide which parts of the federal government need to stay and which parts need to go. And then how Trump remade the federal judiciary, including appointing 3 Supreme Court justices during his first term. And so it is just so hostile to workers now, to bring these claims. And yet, and still, it remains the law of the land. The the equal employment opportunity. And here, you know, in California, as well as in New York, we have very robust state and city protections of civil rights as well. So I agree with Jay. We need to come together and strongly support the individuals who are courageous enough to raise these claims, including by standing as witnesses who corroborate their stories. That's what makes the claims much stronger when it's not a he said, she said situation, but when there are other people in the workplace who are willing to come forward and support that individual. We need to encourage that as well.
Right. Yes, yes. And I think those are excellent ideas and things that, certainly in my practice, to really start having those transparent, frank, direct conversations and preparing, organizations, clients, nonprofits, for-profits that, yes, you are going to be hit with some adversity when it comes to this, but let's get ahead of it and have sort of a toolkit, so to speak, so that we can mitigate, some of that pressure. I know right now, and rightfully so, people are afraid of the litigation, right? Companies, they don't want to spend the time, don't maybe have the money, to spend on it. So they may be retreating, somewhat. But again, I think that sort of recasting how we're doing this work, what some of the, nomenclature and the languages that we use. I know, Karen, we were talking a couple of weeks ago and you said there was a think tank that are kind of putting together new phraseology. Instead of saying DEI, there are, a new library of phrases that folks are coming up with. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm trying to, oh yes, they were saying, if we have to rebrand DEI, what should we call it going forward? And someone suggested HR.
Oh my God. No, please.
I don't know if that's, I
idea.
don't know if that'll work.
I mean,
No,
it
bad
is
idea,
it's
bad
a
idea.
Concept.
juxtaposition because I've always said you can't solve a problem that you don't name, right?
Right.
So why are we going to try to come up with all these euphemisms and change what we call it? And yet, and still, I totally hear what you are saying, Jay, is that this is about basic human behavior and helping humans to relate to one another better. And I also think, you know, as educators in this space, it behooves us not to come in with a patronizing, you're so racist, you're so sexist, blah, blah, blah. That just alienates people, right?
Correct.
But
Sure.
what I try to do in my workshops is I ask questions and get them talking and surfacing their stories and finding their truths and kind of surfacing the best version of themselves, helping them to become the best version of themselves instead of me saying, you know, you're so terrible and you need to become more like me. You know, no one likes
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that because, Dr. Hewlin, my wife and I often talk about DI malpractice and how many people just jumped into the space because they wanted to make
Yes.
money and they were, condescending, and judgmental and just, you need to get this right. We want you to feel uncomfortable. Well, no,
Yes.
actually, that's not the way to get people to win them over, and I think that a lot of this clapback is justified. And I know as a person who does this work, it sounds odd for me to say that, but I've seen some of the impact of this where people have just come in like a bull in a china shop and just tore things apart.
Yeah.
And the thing about it is we are human beings and we're all coming at it from a particular lens, wherever that lens
Sure.
is. We could always agree or disagree about where the lens should be. But if I'm trying to get you to go on a journey with me, the last thing I should be doing is intentionally alienating you to make you feel guilty or shame for what you've done. Even if what you did was shameful.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in because I love this part of the conversation so much. I just wanted to say that I have been also in spaces where I felt frustrated. And I also simultaneously acknowledge that as a practitioner, I show up human and flawed. So I haven't always done the perfect thing or said the, most perfect thing that I can say. So I also named that. But I do have really, really strong feelings about folks who um, do this work. And I know this is going to sound, it sounds how it sounds, but people who do the work because they have lived experience alone, and therefore it makes them a,
Right.
well-rounded expert. I have an issue with that. And I also have issue with folks who are not critical of DEI. I
Right.
think you said it perfectly, Jay. I think as practitioners, it is our job to be critical. And relatively speaking, this is a newer concept and ideology in this country. I mean, if we go all the way back to its roots, the just before we entered the 70s, that's fairly new. So we can't even expect that it's going to be perfect or doesn't have kinks to work out, doesn't have gaps or blind spots within it. So it's not, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We are critical of it. We ask questions. We continue to do research. And, that happens on larger scales, smaller scales, when we're asking our clients, how did you experience, this coaching, this workshop, this, whatever it is. And really allow ourselves to become better through data and
Yeah.
feedback. But I love when people say, oh, DEI, I don't understand, or I don't know. And I really look forward to the space where there are more of us who want to ask questions that help us get to more positive ends, more positive outcomes. I love that you said that. And I
Yeah.
just started word vomiting, but I think that we have to be critical of it. But that's a really great thing. I mean, it's like, writing a really great paper, but there are tons of grammatical errors.
Exactly.
Sometimes nobody cares how great the paper is, right?
Right.
If they can't see past the errors. So it's not trying to get people to focus on the good paper. It's going back, fixing those things that could become a distraction to the overall message. And so I love that you said that. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I think that what's happening now is the impetus for that. I mean, really in the last year or two, I began to hear more of that criticism around, oh, this is just performative.
Mhm.
And we embrace that and do ask the next question. Okay, so how can we measure it? What would be sustainable? What does true allyship look like? And not just allyship for the duration of, I'm in your space. I have a contract for 6 months. I'm in your space. It's not going to change within 6 months. And I am very, very, transparent and direct with clients in terms of that. You are not going to do all of this heart transformation in 6 months, because that's actually what it takes. Right. And then you start seeing some of the behavior. Now, yeah, absolutely. You can start fixing and correcting some of the systems that perpetuate, right, bias, and that perpetuate inequality. And that is more structural. So that's just one piece of it. But the people and culture piece is the component that really takes time to see that change. And again, that measurable change. So again, I think that what has happened and sort of this, setback or clapback will drive us into thinking more strategically, right? More sustainably, more using more measures, more data to really determine what is the next phase of evolution for DEI, right?
Yeah.
One thing we're not going to let DEI do is die. That's not going to happen. And that has been the message that I have tried to share, with clients, with friends, anyone, who is really concerned about their economic wherewithal, their psychological wherewithal, that, hey, there are people, companies, people who really have a lot of power that are really behind sustaining this and keeping it alive. And I think that what each of us do in each of our domains, we're all a part of that ecosystem, right? Of kind of keeping it thriving, so to speak. And it does. I like what Heather said. It really starts with our own humanity. And the little short story I'll tell now, I think this is a perfect time, of how I met Karen. I'm a part of a Black hiking club here in Northern California. And we were hiking, and Karen walks up and starts talking. We're walking along. And eventually I start getting nervous because I saw the white hikers turn off about a half mile back. And so finally, we were having such a great conversation, but I was like, you know what? Really love talking to you, but your people turned off about a half mile ago. And she said, these are my people. I'm with the 510 Black hikers. And that's how I met Karen, and we have been tied at the hip ever since.
How nice.
So that's my bias story. Again, we all have biases, and it's up to all of us to continually work on breaking those biases so that we can move other people along in our journey as well. Well, I know we're out of time. Are there any final thought statements from Jay or Karen, or of course my co-host?
I
Well,
just want to thank you all so much. But please, Jay, go ahead.
No, you took the words out of my mouth. I wanted to thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. It was great to, have the conversation, Karen. It was great to finally meet you. And Heather, it's good to see you again. And Colette,
Yes.
we hang all the time, but I think it's an important conversation to have. And I walk away from it more motivated to think strategically. I mean, that's the big takeaway, right? How do we move this thing forward in a way that makes sense, in a way that's constructive, in a way that is selfless? And that's what it's going to take.
Okay.
That's what it's going to take.
Good.
I would also like to say thank you and say that one of my great sources for hope and inspiration is studying the abolitionist movement, and how the abolitionists foresaw they would not see the end of slavery in their lifetime.
Yes.
But that did not stop them from taking action every single day and from raising their kids. It was an intergenerational struggle with families that were then passing it on to their children and their grandchildren to sustain the movement over time. And I think if we can draw strength from our ancestors, that's how we're going to get through this time. And
Love
we're
that.
going to create that vision for the future that those women you saw the photos of at Spelman, that they saw.
Absolutely. And just for our listeners, this is not the last time you'll hear from these two guests. I certainly want to invite Karen back on to talk in detail about her Interracial Sisterhood coalition, which was launched 2 or 3 years ago and had some really great success so far. And certainly looking forward to inviting Jay and his wife, Dr. Hewlin, and to focus on the work you all are doing and have done on and off Broadway relative to organizational development, cultural competence, and the whole kind of smorgasbord of services that you've offered to your clients, and to really focus on telling the Broadway story, because I don't feel that I can tell that story without Jay and Patricia. Since they were basically, the curators of a lot of that work and a lot of the change that has happened on Broadway. So we will definitely be inviting them back again. And yes, that is.
Can I say a quick thank you? I'm sorry, Colette. I was going to be quiet, but then when you said it again, I have an acknowledgement that you mentioned that Jay, brought you into that space, and Jay, the fruits of that connection just have ripple effects that include me and my consultancy. And so I'm just eternally grateful for the opportunities that have been afforded to me through Colette and Cornerstone. And of course, you know, that originated with you. So thank you so much. It goes back to what you were saying about community and helping one another and really just uplifting one another and not hoarding opportunities. So I just really, really appreciate you. And I also want to give you a hint that when you come back, and I hope it's soon, I really would love to talk to you and Dr. Hewlin about, you know, speaking of Derek Bell and CRT and maintaining white comfort. I
Right.
want to know, how successful do you think, you know, folks living within dominant identities will be when they sue, as Donald Trump has sort of alluded to, um, you know,
Yeah.
because they're uncomfortable with
Right.
equity-centered trainings and programming. So that's just a
Right,
little teaser.
Yes, yes, that is definitely a future conversation where we'll be talking about, you know, these sort of DEI reparations and things of that nature. So yeah, we will save those topics and
Yes.
certainly other very triggering ones for future segments, and certainly look forward to introducing you to other guests that are also in progress of agreeing to be a guest on the show. So thank you all.
Bye-bye.